So one of the things that I've discovered through the years related to theology is that there are the things that I and others are motivated to study, and then the other side are the things that I need to study. And typically, what happens is that I'll read a book and then I'll want to have a conversation with the scholar through the years. We've done that many times now over the last, whatever, 15 or 20 years that we've done these lectures. And secondly, it'll be something that I want to learn about and grow further in. But Dr. Kirk MacGregor of McPherson College, and just of whom has been here, I think five, maybe this is the sixth time, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, I just trust what he is thinking about. So this past fall, I said to him, "What do you want to talk about? What do I need? Not necessarily what I want. And what are you thinking about that you're excited about? And would you be willing to come talk about it?" And I have to tell you that his enthusiasm about the topic, combined with his delight in coming back to be with us, is just in and of itself a motivator. You ever had like somebody working in your house, you say, "Hey, are you sure you don't mind, doing my landscaping or helping me with the garden?" And they're like, "I love it." I'm like, "Okay, let's do this." And so that's exactly what happened with this topic. And the big idea of what you said to me that day is I've been thinking about the ways in which natural theology has, in and of itself, a way that the Trinity is a necessity.
Yes.
That's the gist of it. And so that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So, again, if you would join me in welcoming Dr. Kirk MacGregor, or Dr. K as I call him. Share with us.
Thank you so much for all being here. It is an absolute privilege and delight to be back with TEI. So, the title of the talk this morning is A New Philosophical Argument for the Trinity. This is going to be published in the Festschrift commemorating William Lane Craig's career. And I presented a much shorter version of this. I presented the approximately 3,000 word version at ETS, and this is the approximately 8,000 word version. So the reason why I was motivated to do this project in the first place is that it is kind of a common dictum that there is no way, apart from Scripture, that you can prove that God is exactly three persons. It's pretty well established that you can prove apart from Scripture that God exists. And I think there are at least 24 arguments on display that you could use to prove that God exists. And it's pretty well settled that you can prove apart from Scripture that the God who exists is multi-personal. That is, comprising more than one center of self-consciousness, more than one mind. But the sticking point has always been, can you get to three and exactly three? And a lot of people have thought that this simply cannot be done. And when I first heard that, I thought, wait a minute here. I can kind of see in my mind's eye how you can do this. This is the way a lot of my projects work, where people in the philosophical community will say, I don't see how you can do this. And I start thinking about it a little bit. And I'm like, I can kind of see in my mind's eye how this works. And it takes a while for the idea to sort of percolate down from my mind or my soul down to my brain as to how exactly step by step I would articulate this. But this was the motivation for the paper, which was extremely well received at ETS. So we start out with the question, what is the Trinity? The best way to understand the doctrine of the Trinity is to say that God is one soul. In other words, God is one immaterial spirit containing three distinct minds. And a mind is just a center of self-consciousness or a person. So I am a finite soul containing one mind, containing one center of self-consciousness, one person. By contrast, the soul who is God is infinite, and the soul who is God houses three distinct minds, three distinct centers of self-consciousness or persons. One thing that is really a pet peeve of mine, because it creates far more misunderstanding than it does proper understandings, is the phrase, the Trinity is a mystery. And this drives me crazy because when people say the Trinity is a mystery, they are not defining mystery the way the New Testament understands mystery. A mystery in the New Testament, mysterion, is something that used to be hidden and is now revealed. That's the way Paul uses the word mystery in his epistles. And I would agree in that sense that the Trinity is a mystery, that we see it kind of darkly in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. But if all we had was the Hebrew Bible at our disposal, we probably would not come up with the doctrine of the Trinity. But when you logically piece together the data from the New Testament, then you can rationally grasp the doctrine of the Trinity. So it was once veiled, but in the New Testament, it has become unveiled. And in that sense, it is a mystery. However, when your average person says the Trinity is a mystery, they mean, oh, it defies logic, it defies reason, it engages us in all sorts of conceptual confusions, and you ought just to adore it rather than attempt to understand it. And that is absolutely false, because this idea that God is one soul housing three distinct centers of self-consciousness is very easy to state. It is very easy to understand. It doesn't require any mysticism or mental reservation on anyone's part. And that is simply confused when people say the Trinity is a mystery. One hang-up that many people have, they shouldn't have because it still is present in English, but the hang-up that a lot of people has concerns the way the word is used. So it has been shown repeatedly by biblical scholars that in the biblical languages, the word is does not just come out in one usage. Is can be used to make an identity statement, or is can be used to make a statement of predication. Let me explain the difference. An is of identity. If I say the person standing before you today is Kirk MacGregor, that is an is of identity. I'm saying the person standing before you today equals Kirk MacGregor. However, if I say that the desk is brown, that is an is of predication. By that I mean the desk has the property of being brown. I am predicating an attribute or a property of the desk. I do not mean the desk equals the color brown, so that the color brown, that abstract concept of the color brown, is equivalent to this desk. By no means. The abstract concept of the color brown is an abstract concept. It is most certainly not something that you can come over and pound on. So when we say that the desk is brown, we do not mean that the desk equals a color. we mean the desk has the property or the attribute of being brown. And in the biblical languages, is used repeatedly in both senses. And many times in exactly the same sentence, it's used in both senses. So in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, thinkers flowed seamlessly from is of identity to is of predication, sticking with is of predication for a while, back to is of identity. And unless we understand this, we're bound to be confused when it comes to the doctrine of the Trinity. So to illustrate, an is of identity, these are identity statements. The Trinity is God. Okay? The Trinity equals God. There is only one God. However, it is an is of predication to say the Father is God. By this, we mean the Father has the property of being God. The Son is God. By this, we mean the Son has the property of being God. The Holy Spirit is God. By this, we mean the Holy Spirit has the property of being God. But we do not mean that the Father is the Son, or that the Son is the Holy Spirit, or that any one of the three persons, the Father, the Son, or the Spirit, is identical to the Trinity as a whole. So unless we understand that the Trinity is God, that's an equal sign between the two, or there is only one God. That is used there quite differently than when we say the Father is God. The Father has the property of being God. The Son is God. The Son has the property of being God. The Holy Spirit is God. The Holy Spirit has the property of being God. But that there isn't an equal sign between those two. We're not saying the Father equals God. The Son equals God. The Holy Spirit equals God. Because if we were to say that, then we would have to conclude that the Father is one and the same as the Son is one and the same as the Spirit, or any one of the three persons is equivalent to the Godhead as a whole. So it is crucial that these usages are not confused. So the Trinity is not the assertion that three gods are one God. That is just illogical nonsense. Nor is it the assertion that three persons are one person. That is illogical nonsense. So as I tell my students, both of these are just illogical nonsense. And God, as the God of reason, the supremely rational mind, does not want us engaging in illogical nonsense. Now, one thing that I've noticed over the years in talking about the Trinity, and especially in defending this argument, is that people oftentimes want an analogy for the Trinity. And this raises a good question. Should we want an analogy? I mean, I don't understand why people want an analogy when you can very clearly and succinctly state the actual thing itself. So personally, I don't understand why anyone would want an analogy of the doctrine of the Trinity when we can straightforwardly state the doctrine of the Trinity. The Trinity is the doctrine that God is one soul containing or housing three distinct minds, three distinct centers of self-consciousness, three distinct persons. That just is the doctrine of the Trinity, full stop. So why would anyone want an analogy of something when they already have it? So it's kind of like if Rod had said to me, well, Kirk, it's really great that you want to come back to Missouri and speak at TEI, but we don't really want that. Rather, what we want is an analogy of you. So what's an analogy of you? And I'm like, why do you want an analogy of me when you could actually have me? It makes no sense. However, since people want analogies, there is a very humorous analogy that I'm going to be speaking about how to explain to Jehovah's Witnesses the doctrine of the Trinity tonight. And this is an analogy that should never be used with Jehovah's Witnesses. And the reason why it should never be used with Jehovah's Witnesses is because they believe the doctrine of the Trinity came from paganism. Okay? Now, the analogy that I'm going to use is harmless if you're not talking to a Jehovah's Witness, because any scholar worth their salt knows that this is not where the doctrine of the Trinity came from. There's no possible connection between what I'm going to share and the doctrine of the Trinity. But the Jehovah's Witness, if you share this analogy with them, they're going to say, well, that proves it. The Trinity is definitely pagan. The Trinity just came straight from this thing. And Moreland and Craig's analogy is of the famous three-headed dog from Greek mythology named Cerberus. So here is Cerberus, okay? Not exactly the kind of dog that I would want to run into, okay? So we have here one dog comprising three brains. One dog containing three brains, okay? Not three minds, unless you think that dogs have souls, but one dog containing three brains. Now, just to make things cute, let's call one head Bowser, call another head Rover, and call another head Spike, okay? So we can say, using an is of predication, Bowser is Cerberus. That's absolutely true. We all understand what that means. But we don't think that Bowser is equivalent to the entirety of the dog. Or we could say Rover is Cerberus. Well, that's true. That's an is of predication. But we don't think Rover is equivalent to the totality of the dog. Or Spike is Cerberus. That's true. That's an is of predication, but we don't think that Spike is equivalent to the totality of the dog. Or if I encountered this beast and Rover bit me, I would say Cerberus bit me. That would be absolutely correct. So there are three brains in one dog, like three minds in one God. So it makes perfect sense to say, given our distinction between the two usages of is, that Bowser is Cerberus, is a predication, Rover is Cerberus, is a predication, Spike is Cerberus, is a predication. There is only one Cerberus, statement of identity. And exactly the same thing can be said with the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. There is only one God. Now, can we, without appealing to the Bible, prove that God is a Trinity? I'm not the first person to start on this project, but I believe that I finished the project off where other people who have started before me have fallen short. So the first person to attempt this is the author of the work that you see on the screen. And this was the medieval philosopher and theologian Richard of St. Victor, who lived from 1110 to 1173. And inspired by Richard of St. Victor, two prominent philosophical theologians, Richard Swinburne, who is emeritus at Oxford University, and Joshua Sijuwade, who teaches at the London School of Theology, have attempted to offer a proof based on love. And I think this proof is indeed successful in getting you to at least two persons. But I don't think that it can get you to three and exactly three. Now, when philosophers think about the concept of God, they are greatly indebted to Anselm. Anselm, you might recall, proposed that God is a maximally great being. If there were anything that you could conceive of greater than God, then that would be God. And so God, this little equals with a DF, that's philosophical nomenclature, that reads is by definition. So God is by definition a maximally great being, i.e., a being possessing omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and moral perfection in every possible world. Now, if you're interested, I'm not going to talk about this now unless there are people in the Q&A who would like me to. There is an outstanding proof of the existence of God that was offered by the prominent American philosopher Alvin Plantinga, called the modal ontological argument, where he is actually able to prove that such a God exists, that a maximally great being exists. Now, let's suppose that we just assume that Plantinga's proof works. So if you have the modal ontological argument on the table, you know that there is, in fact, a maximally great being, a being possessing omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence, and moral perfection in every possible world. The question is, what does that entail? Well, let's focus in on moral perfection. A morally perfect being must be an all-loving being, for love is a moral perfection. Okay? Love is a moral perfection. We're talking about a morally perfect being. So it seems like we've got to have an all-loving being. Now, someone might complain, well, why an all-loving being? Why not just a loving being? Well, there are two reasons here. First, it is obviously morally better to be loving than unloving. And secondly, it is obviously morally better to be more loving than less loving. So if you put those considerations together, that it's obviously morally better to be loving than unloving, and that it's obviously morally better to be more loving than less loving, and we're talking about a being who exhibits moral perfection in every possible world, then a morally perfect being must be an all-loving being. Therefore, if God exists, then God must be all-loving. And what's interesting about this is that you can sell most people on this. What I mean is, I teach at a college which, even though it's affiliated with the Church of the Brethren, there is no doctrinal statement or religious requirement for attending McPherson College. And therefore, the percentage of atheists and agnostics in my classes is exactly the same as it would be at, say, the University of Missouri or the University of Kansas or Kansas State University. And when I'm talking to them about this argument, I say, would you agree, even if you don't believe in God, that if God exists, then God is love, that God must be all loving? And virtually everyone thinks that, yeah, even if I don't believe that God exists, I grant that if God does exist, then God is love. Then God is all loving. So there are very few people out there who hold to a concept of God and claim that they represent the Christian tradition and yet say that God is not all loving. Now, there are some whom I would classify as hyper-Calvinists who might go that route, but almost everyone is willing to give you that being all loving belongs to the very concept of God, whether or not one believes that that concept represents something that really exists.
If I can just pause here, that this is at the core of what at least the first point you're making is that it's universally accepted with exceptions.
Yes, yes.
Everyone would agree that a God would have to be God, would have to be loving.
Yeah, would have to be all loving.
This is a
Exactly.
major
Exactly.
first point.
Exactly. There's very few people who are going to want to dispute that. And so this led Swinburne and Sijuwade to frame what they called the love argument. And what you can understand my project is as an attempt to expand the love argument, to fix what they get wrong in the love argument so that it actually does work for 3 and exactly 3. So Swinburne and Sijuwade correctly identify selfless mutuality as an essential requirement of love. Now, if that's true, that leads us to a God comprised of at least 2 persons. Now, let me explain selfless mutuality. What's going on here? Well, since being all loving is an essential attribute of God, then God must always be manifesting it. You can't say, well, being all loving is an essential attribute of God, but there are some days where God's just not feeling it. You can't say that. God must always be manifesting this attribute of being all loving. That's part of what it is to be an essential attribute of God as opposed to an accidental attribute of God. Now, to talk about selfless mutuality as a key requirement of love, this means that love reaches out to another person or persons rather than being centered wholly upon oneself. So love always reaches out to another. Now, someone might say, well, maybe it's enough for God to simply have the disposition to always reach out to someone else, even if there's no one else to reach out to. And there are Unitarian thinkers who have argued this in print, such as the philosopher Dale Tuggy. So he says, no, it's fine for God to simply have the disposition to reach out to another person or persons. But God doesn't need to be always displaying this. And I think it's clear that if love is an essential attribute of God, it is not enough for God to simply have the disposition to love, which is not always manifested. If that's the case, it's not an essential attribute of God. Let me give an analogy. Necessary existence is an essential attribute of God. In other words, existing in all possible worlds is an essential attribute of God. It's not enough for God to just have the disposition to necessarily exist, which is not always manifested. It's not like God could say, well, I have the disposition to necessarily exist, but it may not always be manifested. There might be certain times in which I just don't necessarily exist. That is clearly wrong. If this is an essential attribute of God, it must always be manifested. Now, if we take that seriously, that love reaches out to another person or persons, it doesn't center wholly within oneself. In other words, that love is selflessly mutual, then God can't just have the disposition to love someone who isn't there. It's that there's got to be someone there. So if God exists.
A quick, Kirk.
Yes.
You quoted the philosopher who was a Unitarian, did you say?
Yes, Dale Tuggy.
And a Unitarian, remind us?
A Unitarian is someone who believes in one God in one person. So they would hold that only the Father is God. And Jehovah's Witnesses, whom I'll talk about tonight, are Unitarians in their theology as well.
Got it.
So Arius was a famous Unitarian from church history.
And then God is Father only then does not then include, obviously, Jesus Christ, the Son, and therefore all religions are lead to God, are all roads that can lead to God. Is that the application?
No, not necessarily. There are some Unitarians like Tuggy who want to maintain that even though Jesus is not God, that Jesus is essential for salvation, that Jesus is the agent through whom God has chosen uniquely to work. So Tuggy would hold that Christianity is the one true religion, even though he's a Unitarian. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that their group alone is the one true religion. They refer to themselves as the truth, and they are Unitarian. Judaism is Unitarian, but an Orthodox Jew does not believe that all roads lead to God. Same is true with Islam. Islam is Unitarian. So, no, it doesn't lead to that. I can see how someone might try to make it lead to that, but the religions that usually are Unitarian don't make that application, interestingly enough. Good point.
And the point I was making was that Unitarians, as I understood them, you can be wherever you are and come and worship together and it be affirmed typically.
That would be true of the religious group known as Unitarian Universalists.
Oh, okay.
And what is very important is that there is a distinction between a Unitarian, just that term being used literally, which means one God in one person, versus a Unitarian Universalist, which that carries a lot more baggage. So there can be atheists, agnostics,
Right.
people who practice Wicca in Unitarian Universalism, people who don't even hold to a concept of God, and yet they're not literally Unitarian. But the reason why that name has stuck is because Unitarianism began back in the 16th century. Well, it began a lot earlier than that, but it became a distinct movement in the 16th century, focused on the idea of one God in one person. And then as a result of religious liberalism in the 17th and 18th centuries, went in wildly different directions. So it's terminological similarity only when you talk about a philosophical Unitarian versus a Unitarian Universalist.
I was unaware of that. I was only thinking through the latter category.
Yeah. So if God exists, God must be perpetually giving God's self in love to at least one other. But who is this other or others? Well, it cannot be any created person, since creation is the result of God's free will, not the result of God's nature. It belongs to God's very essence to be all-loving, but it does not belong to God's essence to create. What I mean by that is God is necessarily all-loving, but God is not necessarily creating. There are possible worlds in which God exists alone, apart from the universe, where God chooses not to create any universe at all. So God doesn't have to create anything, but God is necessarily all-loving. In other words, God would still be all-loving even if no created persons existed. Moreover, we know from science that created persons have not always existed from eternity, that God is eternally all-loving. Therefore, created persons are not a sufficient explanation of who the other or others is to whom God's love is necessarily directed. And that has very important consequences.
Can you restate that before you go leave it?
Sure.
The last point.
So created persons are not a sufficient explanation of who the other or others is to whom God's love is necessarily directed. It can't be created persons because, first of all, God didn't have to create anyone. And second, created persons have not always existed from eternity. But God is eternally all-loving.
So we people, as people, we are not a sufficient explanation.
Correct.
For the fact that God's love needs to express itself.
Right. Because that's the problem when people say, oh, well, the reason why God created us is because God needed someone to love and God got lonely. No, that is not
That's
it.
good.
That since God, by God's essence, is all loving, God must always be displaying that attribute. And God didn't have to create anything. Prior to creation of anything, God was still all loving. So that means that you can't explain this by invoking created persons.
And just quickly, if I said, therefore, it's not an attribute of God to be creator, would that
That
be accurate?
it's not an essential attribute. In other words,
Essential
it doesn't belong to God's essence to create.
Right.
God can do it. God is essentially omnipotent, which gives God the ability to create, but God doesn't have to actually use that
But
ability.
it is a necessarily essential attribute for God to be loving.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Correct. So the consequence of this is pretty straightforward. The other or others to whom God's love is necessarily directed must be internal to God in God's own being. Okay. So what that shows is that God is not a single isolated individual, as the philosophical Unitarian will want to hold. Rather, God is a plurality of persons. And this is why we can say philosophically Unitarian, one person doctrines of God, such as the Jewish doctrine, the Islamic doctrine, and the Aryan doctrine, are philosophically insufficient. They don't truly get us to a God who is all loving. You don't truly have the notion that God is love. However, even though this will get us to at least two, I don't see how this gets us to exactly three. And there are many philosophers who would agree with my assessment on that. So Swinburne and Sijuwade fail in my judgment to get us to exactly three persons.
Is this a good place for a break?
Yeah, it's a great place for a
How are we
break.
doing in terms of time overall?
We're doing fine.
Okay, all right. All right, well, let's pause the recording there.
Didn't you go back to the low argument slide?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Dr. K, because where we've been so far has really fleshed out in greater detail the specifics to slow down the paper that I heard at the Evangelical Theological Society when you first presented it. And I would say that I pretty much caught the basic ideas, but this has really helped to reinforce them. But where we're headed next, I did not pick up on. I could not, even in my explanations of, when people said, what are we talking about? I could do this part, but I was like, and there's a third thing, but we're going to have to wait to hear it again. So I'm really excited to hear this. So let's launch back into that. Okay.
All right. Sounds good. So the two questions that I think Swinburne and Sijuwade have a difficult time answering are these. Why a third person? Why stop with three? Now, Swinburne's rationale for a third person is that a twosome can be selfish. But the problem here is that he equivocates on the term selfish when concluding that unselfish love requires a third person. The term selfish is used literally to denote one person thinking only of oneself. However, the premise about the selfishness of a twosome employs selfish metaphorically to denote a group acting as if it were a self and thinking only about the other members of the group. But the problem is any group with n members where n is greater than or equal to 2 can be selfish in the metaphorical sense. A great illustration is the phenomenon of tribalistic nationalism, in which, say, millions of citizens of a nation think only about themselves and hence the nation, as opposed to anyone outside the citizenry of that nation. So it's clear that this equivocation on the term selfish isn't going to guarantee a third person, because yes, a twosome are not going to be selfish in the literal sense of the term, but only in the metaphorical sense. And he needs for this to work in the literal sense of the term. But there's no reason for stopping with three if you're going to take this metaphorical approach, because three persons can be selfish. They can think only of themselves as a group. Four persons can be selfish. An entire nation can be selfish. Now, Sijuwade's rationale for a third person is even more controversial. He holds that an erotic relationship exists between the first two persons. And he then argues, based on an analogy with human relationships, he says an erotic relationship is unfulfilled for a married couple when they refuse to procreate. And he therefore argues by analogy that the first two divine persons must generate a third person. Now, I think you can see that these are highly controversial premises.
Yeah.
I find highly dubious the claim that an erotic relationship exists between the first two persons. Likewise, I find highly dubious the claim that an erotic relationship is unfulfilled for a married couple when they refuse to procreate. But let's suppose we granted Sijuwade all of these things. Why stop with three? Even on Sijuwade's argument, there's no reason for stopping with three, because you could say, well, a human family, the more children, the merrier, right? Why stop with three? So it doesn't seem that Swinburne or Sijuwade get beyond just we need at least two, because they can't adequately answer these two questions. Why a third person and why stop with three? So can we rehabilitate the love argument? Very interestingly, Swinburne in a footnote appeals to the philosopher Robert Adams, who makes this observation. Quote, the possessive lover wants to limit the life of the beloved to their two-membered relationship with each other. A non-possessive lover wants the beloved to live a larger life and wants to share it with him. Now, this struck me because I believe Adams's observation holds great promise if developed and defended. However, no such development or defense occurs in Swinburne or Sijuwade. Also noteworthy is Swinburne and Sijuwade's admission that no divine person can be contingent. It must be necessary. In other words, it must exist in all possible worlds. And therefore, my argument focuses on these two considerations. So, I would say, in addition to selfless mutuality, which you could think of as the positive requirement of love, you could think of love as being a double-sided coin, where one side of the coin is selfless mutuality. And I think that the negative side, the other side of the coin, is an absence of unhealthy possessiveness. So, I argue that the absence of unhealthy possessiveness is a second essential requirement of love. We can think, as I say, of selfish mutuality as the positive requirement of love, and the absence of unhealthy possessiveness as the negative requirement of love. So what do I mean by unhealthy possessiveness? Unhealthy possessiveness is, by definition, the property of a relationship's being construed such that for any two persons X and Y, only X can be the source of love for Y, and only Y can be the source of love for X. By contrast, healthy possessiveness between X and Y, and there most certainly is such a thing as healthy possessiveness between X and Y, treasures certain intimate aspects of their relationship as exclusive, and so are unwilling to share those aspects with a third party. To give a human example, sexual fidelity within marriage. I can legitimately say to my wife, you can have sex with me and no one else. Alexander Pruss, who is a prominent philosopher who has talked about human relationships, poses the relevant question this way. He says, quote, now one may ask whether the content of the commitment needs to involve sexual exclusivity. Suppose, for instance, that a couple simply commit to have sex with one another for life, but do not commit to not have sex with others. Is this not a sufficient temporal extension of their sexual union? End quote. He correctly responds that, quote, it does not appear sufficient to generate the deep form of union that romantic love seeks. Phenomenologically, a significant exclusivity appears appropriate to romantic love. We should thus avoid saying that jealousy is completely wrong. When jealousy goes wrong, it seems to be through a defect of the trust proper to romantic relationship. The full organic union for which romantic love yearns, with that union having the full personal and normative significance that commitment can give it, requires a commitment not just to future sexual acts, but to sexual exclusivity. Likewise, any two divine persons could participate in unidirectional and therefore analogously intimate eternal loving acts that would not be shared with any additional person. So the Father could have a special type of love for the Son, and the Son could have a different type of special love for the Spirit, and the Father could have a different type of special love for the Spirit. Now, that love between the Father and the Son, no one else is in on that. The love between the Father and the Spirit, no one else is in on that. The relationship between the Son and the Spirit, no one else is in on that. Okay? So any two divine persons could participate in those unidirectional and therefore analogously intimate eternal loving acts that would not be shared with any additional divine person. So, were there additional divine persons, either the first or the second, could participate in different unidirectional eternal loving acts with any such person that would be exclusive to that relationship?
All right, hang on, Dr. K.
Yes.
I'm spinning here. So
Okay.
unless
Okay.
you're gonna break out where we've been, we're gonna have to back up.
Okay.
Can we do
I am
that?
going to break out where we're going to be.
You are, so you think I'll catch up?
I
Because
think you're going to catch up right here.
okay,
All right.
because when you read that long quote and then the phrase before it, I just was like, oh, I'm kind of picking up on
Okay.
the possessiveness of the
Yes.
special
Yes.
relationship
Yes.
cannot be.
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
not okay.
yeah.
The flip side makes sense. All right.
Yes. All
I'll
right.
hang with you.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that here's my example. Here's my illustration. My engagement was in sex with my wife and my engagement in the distinctly loving act of father-son relationship with my 12-year-old son generates no betrayal of trust of, and so no improper jealousy between me and my wife. In other words, yes, my wife and I have healthy possessiveness in our love, that sex is between us and no one else. But there would be something majorly wrong if my wife said, well, I'm just jealous because, like, you have this unique love of your son. I'm jealous. You're cheating on me. It's like, no, I'm not cheating on you, because the type of love which is exclusive to our relationship, that's one distinctly intimate act. It's a completely different intimate act of father-son relationship with my 12-year-old son. So my wife doesn't feel her trust is betrayed when I show my love for my son. She doesn't get jealous of the fact that I'm loving my son, right? If she were to do such things, This would be unhealthy possessiveness. So what I'm trying to do is to draw the distinction between healthy possessiveness and unhealthy possessiveness. And the reason why I'm doing this is because one question that I received at ETS when I first presented this paper, and I did not make this distinction, is someone said, well, then couldn't you say that like people should be able to have a threesome? You know, and I'm like, no, I'm not saying that at all. And I found it very obvious that I needed to pose a distinction between unhealthy possessiveness and healthy possessiveness. That if you think that there are unique loving relationships between, say, the father and the son, which is a distinct type of relationship, which is different from that between the son and the spirit or the father and the spirit, then it's possible for the father to have like a healthy possessiveness of his relationship with the son and a healthy possessiveness of his relationship with the spirit, and for the son to have a healthy possessiveness of his relationship with the spirit. That's possible. I'm not saying that any of those things are, but I'm saying that those things are possible. And that's not an invalidation of my argument. My argument says, yes, you can have that, but there is an absence of unhealthy possessiveness. Unhealthy possessiveness is going to look like this. It's going to be where, like, me and my wife is like, oh, you're going to take Dwayne out to, Dwayne is my son, you're going to take Dwayne out to a basketball game. I'm jealous. No, 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 no. Dwayne, he's got to be off limits. The only person you can receive any facet of love from at all is me. That's it. Okay. And so that's what I'm saying is unhealthy possessiveness. Is that making sense?
Yeah, if you'll back up 2 slides and we'll just, I don't want to belabor this too long, but yeah, at the bottom there,
Yes.
read that last. By contrast,
Healthy possessiveness between X and Y treasures certain intimate aspects of the relationship as exclusive, and so are unwilling to share those aspects with a third party.
that's an appropriate healthy possessiveness.
Correct,
that you-
correct,
that you
correct.
added, as opposed to unhealthy. Okay,
Right, right.
And now the next slide.
And now the next slide. Yep.
Okay,
So-
read that for me.
Likewise, any two divine persons could, again stressing the word could, participate in unidirectional and therefore analogously intimate eternal loving acts that would not be shared with any additional divine person.
Okay, and why is that? Sorry, but why is that important?
It's
to say.
important. It's important because there are people who will say that couldn't the father have a special filial relationship with the son? Couldn't he? And the spirit wouldn't be in on that, would he? And isn't that somehow analogous to the sexual relationship within marriage? And if you were to make that type of argument, I could say, sure, that would be possible. But that doesn't defeat my argument, because my argument is about the absence of unhealthy possessiveness.
Gotcha.
That's why that needs to be there.
Okay.
Excellent question. So, arguments that the nature
You're
of
fine.
love,
Thank you.
arguments that the nature of love includes an absence of unhealthy possessiveness. So let's consider a loving relationship between two humans, H1 and H2. It is relatively uncontroversial that any relationship where H1 says to H2, you can love me and no one else, and you can receive love from me and no one else, displays unhealthy possessiveness and is therefore problematic. So a quote here from the Taylor Counseling Group. They say, if a partner says they don't like it when you hang out with certain friends, it's a sign of controlling behavior. Your partner is trying to control your movements and keep you dependent on them. Possession can feel a lot like addiction. You might come to rely on the other person for your self-worth, looking to them for validation because you have no one else in your life. In reality, having many supportive people in your life is much healthier.
Yeah.
And notice that many entails at least two others. And I would say that we want to think of God as the maximally great being. God must display the greatest possible state of mental health. Indeed, God is the paradigm of good mental health per se. So, continuing in this vein, it is unhealthily possessive and hence defective for H1 to set up the relationship so that, in fact, H2 can only love H1 and receive love from H1. So let's think about the relationship between my 12-year-old son and his best friend. It would be wrong of my son to demand that his best friend love only him, or that his best friend receive love from only him. If my son makes those demands, he lacks perfect love for his best friend. Another illustration, I cannot ethically cut my wife off from all other relationships. Can't love your sister, can't love your parents, can't love Dwayne. I can't ethically cut my wife off from all other relationships so that I am the only person she can love or from whom she can receive any facet of love. Francis Berenson is an outstanding philosopher, and he has written an article on the nature of love. And he says this is the lesson Tolstoy wishes to convey through his title character, Anna Karenina. So regarding Count Vronsky and her son, Anna, quote, perceives any separation of their activities from her as a betrayal of her and her love. She cannot bear the thought of either of them being engaged in activities or amusements which exclude her. She goes through torture as a result of her possessiveness. She has not learned to love, only to possess completely. Now, you might say, all right, but what about like two people on a desert island? So, perfect love therefore requires that the lover desire the beloved to receive love from at least one other. And this is true even if H1 and H2 are alone on a desert island. Even if H1 was not deliberately possessive in an unhealthy way. So H1's not trying to be possessive in an unhealthy way. And let's say H2 isn't either. The ontology of the relationship, in other words, the being of the relationship, the structure of the relationship between H1 and H2 is the same as though H1 were. For the relationship between H1 and H2 to move closer to perfect love, H1 must desire for H2 to love and receive love from another person than H1. This is true even if the desire remains unfulfilled. Now, in God, you can't have these unfulfilled desires remaining. And so this allows us to make an a fortiori argument. An a fortiori argument is an argument from the lesser to the greater. What we have been saying about human relationships also applies to the relationships of divine love and applies all the more. Suppose God is comprised of only two persons. Even though neither of the two persons is deliberately possessive in an unhealthy way, the ontology of their relationship, the structure of the relationship, is the same as though they were. As in the case with H1 and H2, the first divine person would necessarily desire for the second divine person to love and receive love from another person than the first. And the second person would necessarily desire for the first person to love and receive love from another person than the second.
Can you just pause for a moment?
Yes.
Read that again. First. The first divine person would necessarily desire for the second divine person to love and receive love from another person than the first. And the second person would necessarily desire for the first person to receive. So this is what would make them healthily possessive and yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so So this is going to be the case if God is comprised of only two persons. Now, the problem is, unlike the relationship between H1 and H2, those people on a desert island, this desire cannot remain unfulfilled. For if it did, then there would be a defect or lack in God, rendering God no longer a maximally great being. Paul Tillich, who is a theologian that interestingly was very helpful in writing this piece. The reason why I say interestingly very helpful is because Tillich is no friend of historic biblical Christianity. But Tillich says this in the first volume of his systematic theology. He says, "Love does not destroy the freedom of the beloved and does not violate the structures of the beloved's individual and social existence." Notice how I italicized "and social existence." Neither does love surrender the freedom of him who loves, and it does not violate the structures of his individual and social existence. Note well how for Tillich, love requires that both the lover and the beloved have a social existence which goes beyond the relationship between the two. This demands, at minimum, the existence of at least one other divine person who supplies social existence for both lover and beloved. While one could try to avoid this reasoning by using the dispositional argument, arguing that the two persons comprising a perfectly loving God need only have the disposition for the other person to love someone other than himself, it is clearly greater for God to eternally realize this disposition. Recall that this disposition is necessary, not contingent, so that it cannot be satisfied by God's freely chosen act of creation. God can't say, well, I desire for the second person to love someone other than myself, and the second person can't say, I desire for the first to love someone other than myself. So let's go create somebody. No, this is a necessary disposition, not a contingent disposition. So the eternal existence of a perfectly loving God entails that every necessary disposition of love is eternally satisfied. Accordingly, the only way for God to be a maximally great being is for God to be essentially comprised of at least three persons. So now we're to at least three persons, not just to at least two persons. For then, the relationships within the Godhead would be entirely free of unhealthy possessiveness. But now we might ask the same question of my argument that I asked of Swinburne and Sijuwade. Is this minimum also the maximum? Well, here's where the second consideration will come into play. They correctly note that any divine person must exist necessarily, not merely contingently. The philosopher C.A. Mackintosh captures this sentiment in what he calls Mackintosh's eraser. So I'm sure you've all heard of Occam's razor before, and this is his riff on Occam's razor. He calls this Mackintosh's eraser, which holds that just as we shouldn't multiply fundamental entities beyond necessity, we also shouldn't multiply parts of a fundamental entity beyond necessity. So we've seen two essential qualities of love: the positive requirement of selfless mutuality and the negative requirement of the absence of unhealthy possessiveness. Exactly three divine persons supply the necessary and sufficient conditions to satisfy their conjunction. What's interesting is, if you are aware of academic philosophy, you know that there are two branches of academic philosophy. There is the analytic tradition and there is the continental tradition. I won't go into the details of the differences between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, other than to just give you a little bit of demographics here. Analytic theology is primarily, not exclusively by any means, but primarily the type of philosophy practiced in the Anglophone world, the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK. By contrast, continental philosophy is the major, but again, not the only style of philosophy that is practiced on the European continent. So most French philosophers, German philosophers, Austrian philosophers would be continental philosophers. And it's very rare that you can get these two sides to agree. And I think that you can elicit support for this argument from both analytic philosophy and from continental philosophy. So I quoted Alexander Pruss earlier, who is a prominent analytic philosopher at the University of Texas. And he observes that real union between any two persons, X and Y, entails, quote, togetherness, achieving an additional union through their shared activity. And so I emphasize that word shared activity. Real union between any two persons, X and Y, entails togetherness, but they achieve an additional union through their shared activity. And I wonder, well, what is the best possible type of shared activity if we're thinking about a maximally great being here? So I see the conjunction of selfless mutuality and the absence of unhealthy possessiveness as yielding what Pruss calls real union. As Moreland and Craig observe, selfless mutuality requires a community of at least two persons. Now, Pruss contends that real union between X and Y, and I quote, is the particular form of togetherness to which one is called by the nature of a given form of love. So I'm thinking, what kind of togetherness must we be dealing with? What would be the best possible shared activity between any two divine persons, X and Y? Well, from this I surmise that if God is a maximally great being, then God must exemplify the best form of love. And that would mean that the shared activity through which any two divine persons attain it must be the best or tied for the best kind of activity. And here I think that there is a best kind of activity. And I would base this off of the insight that mind, that center of self-consciousness, that person is the most fundamental reality. And if that's the most fundamental reality, mind, center of self-consciousness, person, then the best kind of activity is the loving of at least one other person, which the absence of unhealthy possessiveness guarantees. So it seems that love qua love, then, propels itself toward a community of n persons where n is greater than or equal to 3. Now, Pruss doesn't give me the is equal to 3. He gives me greater than or equal to 3, but the is equal bit comes out of any divine person must exist necessarily, not merely contingently. So we move on then to support from continental philosophy, and here I go back to Paul Tillich. So Tillich, in his book Love, Power, and Justice, maintains that love qua love, and I quote, is the moving power of life and the drive towards the unity of the separated, where reunion presupposes separation of that which belongs essentially together. So he's saying that love drives toward the unity of the separated, and the reunion presupposes that you've got the separation of two persons, but that they will be reunited, that they belong essentially together. Now, what's interesting here is that Tillich, in that very book, even goes so far as to comment that, quote, such a description of life is strictly analogous to the Trinitarian interpretation of the living God. In his Son, God separates himself from himself, and in the Spirit, he reunites himself with himself. but he immediately offers the discount that this, of course, is a symbolic way of speaking. However, I see no reason why the discount should hold apart from the masculine pronouns. In other words, I don't think that God, in and of God's self, is male. I don't think of, God as in and of God's self as masculine. I see that the masculinity comes in the incarnation, Jesus becoming man. That's true, but I don't see any of the three persons of the Trinity as being in and of themselves gendered. So I think that that's the only way in which the discount should hold. But the reason why he thinks this discount should hold is for quite different reasons altogether. But I think Tillich speaks here better than he knows. So in Tillich's remark on Trinitarianism, I think he speaks better than he knows. Regarding any two Trinitarian persons belonging to the same soul, the only thing that could separate them, at least if you don't take into account Christ bearing the sin of the world, is their personal distinctiveness. That's the only thing that could separate them, is their personal distinctiveness. And for their love to be perfect, there must be something, indeed the greatest something, striving for their reunion, one which maintains their distinctiveness as centers of self-consciousness. And that greatest something is a third person. And therefore, what Tillich says about the Father, the Son, and the Spirit could equally apply to any permutation of the three. So let's focus on my getting to the exactly 3 bit. Why stop with 3? Well, here I'm going to appeal to a plausibly modest version of what in philosophy is known as the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. And by this I mean that any necessary divine person must have a raison d'etre, a reason for that person's being, which may lie in the necessity of that person's nature. Probing the necessity of God's nature, which must be all loving, the essential qualities of love supply the raison d'etre, reason for being, for 3 divine persons. However, any further divine person would lack a raison d'etre, a reason for being. So any nth divine person where n is greater than 3 would exist contingently rather than necessarily. Now, this is especially important if one thinks, as I do, I haven't argued for it here. In the published version, I do argue extensively for this. I am, as I intimated before, one of those philosophers who does not think that eternal generation of one divine person by another is possible. So if one regards eternal generation of one divine person by another as impossible, as I do, then the situation is even worse. It's not just any nth divine person where n is greater than 3 that exists contingently rather than necessarily, but it would be every divine person in a community where n is greater than 3 would exist contingently rather than necessarily. So let me illustrate this by a reductio ad absurdum. Suppose that God is a soul comprising n divine persons, where n is greater than 3, with no logical order of generation between the persons. It's not like the Father is the logically first person who eternally generates the Son, who is logically the second divine person, and the Father by himself, or the Father and the Son tag team together to eternally generate a third divine person. So let's suppose you think that eternal generation like that is impossible. Well, if that's impossible, if there's no logical order of generation between the persons, and you've got more than 3 divine persons within God, then every person is going to be contingent. For that person might not have existed, since at least 3 others also exist, and only 3 are necessary. In other words, any divine person would exist only in some, but not all, possible worlds. So there would be a possible world in which, well, for any group of, let's say, 4, and if there's no order of generation, then it's like, well, you only needed 3, only 3 need to exist. So for any one of the 4, might not have been that one, right? So there's a possible world in which these 3 exist and the 4th is out, and these other 3 exist and another 4th one is out, and these 3 exist and another 4th is out, and another possible world in which these other 3 exist and another 4th one is out. Regarding each divine person, then, no satisfactory answer to the question, why does it exist, may be given. Thus, a divine soul of n persons, where n is greater than 3, if you think that eternal generation is impossible, deprives all n persons of a raison d'etre, all n persons of a reason for being. But this is absurd. So I see 2 absurdities here. If we say that we have a nth divine person where n is greater than 3, like we had 4 divine persons. Well, the problem there is that at least the 4th person is going to exist contingently, not necessarily. And since any divine person must exist necessarily, then you can't have a 4th. You've got to stop at 3. And if I'm right that you can't have eternal generation, then if you had a community of 4, then you would threaten the necessity of all 4 of the persons by virtue of that. And either way, God is necessarily and precisely 3 divine persons. So if we summarize this argument in a syllogism, and philosophers love syllogisms, so can't have a good philosophical paper without a syllogism. So let's end with one. Has a lot of premises to it, but I think you can see the structure of the argument. Premise 1, God is the one and only maximally great being. I said from the start that I was going to presuppose that Alvin Plantinga has successfully demonstrated this in his modal ontological argument. So premise 1, God is the one and only maximally great being. 2, a maximally great being essentially possesses every great-making property. That should be fairly straightforward. If it didn't, it wouldn't be a maximally great being. 3.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah. So if you're talking about a maximally great being must essentially possess every great-making property. Because if it didn't, if there was like some great-making property that your alleged maximally great being doesn't possess, then it's not really a maximally great being. You can always think of a being who's greater, namely one who possesses that great-making property. And putting those 3 premises together, we can say, therefore, God is essentially all-loving. That follows from 1 to 3. So we've got God being essentially all-loving given the first 3 premises. 5, love possesses 2 essential qualities: selfless mutuality and the absence of unhealthy possessiveness. So those are our 2 essential qualities of love that we've seen: selfless mutuality and the absence of unhealthy possessiveness. And from 4 and 5, we get 6. Therefore, God is essentially selflessly mutual and essentially not unhealthily possessive. Then we moved on. 7, selfless mutuality requires a community of at least 2 persons. 8, the absence of unhealthy possessiveness requires a community of at least 3 persons. Since I see people taking pictures, should I stop for a moment before going on to slide number 2 of this?
Yes.
All right, I will. People still writing? Am I good? All right. So number 9. Therefore, God is essentially a community of at least 3 persons. That's from 6 to 8. Then 10, any divine person must exist necessarily, not merely contingently. 11, exactly 3 divine persons.
If I substitute the word hypothetically or contingently, is it the same?
I think for your purposes, yes. So something that has contingent being may or may not exist. It exists in some, but not all possible worlds. So, for example, I exist contingently. I'm not hypothetical, but I exist in some possible worlds. It's not the case. I mean, like in a possible world where my parents didn't meet, I don't exist. So any divine person can't be like that. They can't be like me. They have to exist necessarily in every possible world, not merely contingently.
It has to be fulfilled. It has to get done.
Yeah, it has to be there. So 11, exactly 3 divine persons supply the necessary and sufficient conditions to fulfill the conjunction of selfless mutuality and the absence of unhealthy possessiveness. 12, therefore, any community of divine persons greater than 3 will include at least 1 member who exists contingently. So I phrase this to be modest so that it could appeal to those both who believe that there is eternal generation, like people who would say, no, I take the language of the Nicene Creed really serious, like the Son is eternally begotten of the Father, and the Spirit who proceeds from at least the Father, if not the Son, if you take that addition to the Nicene Creed. So I say we'll include at least 1 member. So at least the 4th member is going to exist contingently. And if you don't think that relationships of divine generation are possible, then if you have a community of divine persons greater than 3, then they're going to all exist contingently. And you can't have that either way. 13, therefore, no community of divine persons can be greater than 3 from 12 and 10. And that leads to the conclusion, therefore, God is essentially a community of exactly 3 persons from 9 and 13. So I believe that pretty much wraps up the argument. And I'm ready whenever you are for questions and answers.
Just before we stop recording, the one that I'm still wrapping my mind around, although I've made great progress, is this idea of that a 4th person would be a contingency.
Yeah.
In other words, what makes sense to me is that 3 completes the picture.
Yes.
3 fills out the qualities that are necessary.
Right.
And the 4th automatically creates this possibility, hypothetically, contingency, and therefore it undermines the 3-ness in and of itself.
Yeah.
Did I get there?
Yeah. And even more than that, for that very reason, it doesn't need to be there. It doesn't need to exist. And if it doesn't need to exist,
right,
then there is a possible world in which it doesn't exist. And therefore it exists contingently.
And therefore it undermines the other 3.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Wow. I don't know that I could repeat it, but I think I got it. Join me in giving Kirk a big hand for his. So